So today we're going to be talking about the leader's character, and we want to put this in perspective of stepping out of the shadows and into the light with our character. So we all have our internal demons and our selfishness and those shadowy parts of our personality that we need to overcome in order to be good leaders. Well, in order to do that, we need to go on the offensive. So we need to replace our unhealthy motivations and develop a positive leadership style. And we do this through developing our positive leadership traits and qualities that we call virtues. So, the really neat thing about virtues is that both the Eastern and the Western cultures agree on virtues. So, um, Confucius in the East and Aristotle in the West both agreed that there are these universal virtues that a good leader should have. And that also helps us not just become a good leader, but to really lead a good life. So, we talk about some of these virtues in your personal development class if you guys have taken that. And those in that class, we go much more in depth than what we do here. But let's give you a little bit of an overview. So, virtues have four important features, and these are important whether you're a leader or whether you're just an everyday person. So, one is virtues are not easily developed, but they do persist over time. So, it does take practice for you to hone those virtues and really grow them. But once you have them, they pretty much stay with you for your whole life. Two, they shape the way that leaders see and behave, and really anybody. So, if you're looking through the lens of courage, of grit, of humanity, then you are seeing things in a different way that somebody who is not using those virtues to see with. And that in turn will change how you behave. Three, they operate independently of the situation. So, virtuous leaders will not abandon their virtues to please their followers or to please their company or really to please anybody. So, we're not depending on a specific rule, a specific law, or a specific organizational policy to make us act a certain way. We're depending on our individually personalized virtues. And finally, they help leaders live better lives. So, in general, if you practice these virtues, you will have a more positive life and you will see more positive outcomes than if you are living without some of these virtues. So, some of the virtues we're going to touch on are wisdom and knowledge. These are our cognitive strengths entailing the acquisition and use of our knowledge. We draw knowledge from our experience, being highly skilled at thinking, and we select the best course of action given the situation. So, our knowledge we gain throughout our lifetime. So, it's really important to draw information from wherever you can throughout your life and really take that and process it and hold on to those knowledge and skills. The second one we're going to look at is courage. So, this is emotional strength involving the exercise of will to accomplish the goals in the face of opposition. This is overcoming our fear in order to do the right thing. So, I've said in other classes that we really think of courage as like fighter fighters running into a burning building to save somebody or soldiers in combat, but it takes a lot of courage to stand up to your boss and tell them that you don't think what they're doing is right. It takes a lot of courage to stand up at a board meeting in front of a group of people and saying what they're doing is unethical, or even just to stand up for your friend if somebody is bullying them. So, all those things are courage. And so, we really need to put the practice of courage into our everyday lives and not think about it just in this extreme circumstance type of situation. Next is grit. This is the motivation to pursue long term goals with sustained effort. So, grit has two facets preservation and passion. Um, and grit is really more important than talent. And so, I say this because you can have all the talent in the world, but if you don't have grit to finish out what you've started, you will never ever get to the end. So I think that getting a degree, whether it's a bachelor's, whether it's a master's, whether it's a doctorate, it's really about grit because the process of learning and being in the classroom, everyone has that ability to sit through a class and do the work. And yes, some people might have to try harder and study longer than others, but it really is the grit to say that semester after semester, whenever you're tired, whenever you're exhausted, whenever you have to go to work, whenever you have to take care of your kids, that you are going to persevere. You're going to keep going. You're going to be passionate enough about wanting your degree that you're going to finish out to the end. So again, you could be the smartest person in the world, but if you don't have the grit to sit through class after class, semester after semester, then you'll never end up with a degree. The next one is humanity, which is interpersonal strength that involves tending to and befriending others. So this is really just taking care of people around us, being nice, being kind, being, we're going to talk about compassionate here in a minute, but it really is how we perceive other people and how we take care of them. Justice is the civic strength underlying healthy community life. There is an obligation to the common good and treating others fairly and equally. So a lot of times when we think of justice, we think of it in terms of police laws and rules, and that has a lot to do with it. But in terms of being a leader, it really is part of treating people fairly and equally whenever you're in the workplace. So temperance, this is the strength of protecting against excess. So it's also called moderation, and we've already always said moderation is key. It's key in controlling our emotions, our pleasures, our desires, that whether it's food, alcohol, sex, wealth, all of that has to be taken in moderation. And we can really see, the slippery slopes of leaders that might have been good leaders, but they were not temperate and they let their greed for wealth take over their normal judgments. And then we have humility, and this is being humble. So a lot of people think that humility means that you don't have any self-esteem, but that's not true. Humility is not low self-esteem. Humility is self-awareness, it's openness, it's transcendence, which is a power greater than ourselves. So when we think about all that, it's knowing who we are, willing to be vulnerable about who we are, and then understanding that there's this transcendence, which is knowing that there's something out there greater than ourselves. Whether you believe in God, whether you believe in many gods, whether you don't believe in anything at all, to understand that we are not the end all be all in our lives or in our organization, that there's somebody higher, whether it's our board of trustees or whether it is a higher power in the universe, there's something greater than us, and that we can't be the end all be all for ourselves or for anybody. And then finally, compassion. So this is kindness, this is generosity, this is love. This really goes hand in hand with humanity, but this is putting other ahead of ourselves. So we want to look out for the good of others, and so that involves having courage in order to do so, and serving others. So when we talk about compassion, a lot of people and talk about serving others, a lot of people think that if you serve other people, then that's not a form of leadership. There's actually a whole leadership theory devoted to servant leadership and putting others before yourself. So you can be a good leader and a really good person if you can show compassion. So now that we know that leadership character is important and it involves all these different virtues, we need to know, how do we build character? So one of the ways that we can do this is through finding a role model. So role models help us by letting us examine other people's character, and through that we can find those characteristics and those virtues that we find that are positive and that we want to emulate. So there are three characteristics that we can learn from moral people. So the first one is certainty. So these are moral exemplars that are sure of what they believe and they take responsibility for acting on their own convictions. So if you have good character, then you can be really certain in your decisions. So you don't have to second guess yourself, because you know that your character and those virtues that you hold will help you make the right choice. The second one is positivity. And so these are people who take a positive approach to life, even in the face of hardship. So they enjoy what they do and are optimistic about the future. Now, does this mean that they're falsely positive or that they're faking it? No, this means that they understand that as long as they stay on the right road, then they will get to where they want to go. So even though that path may be hard, they know that there will eventually be a positive outcome. And so in that way, they can always be positive about the future because again, they know that they're making the right decision based on their character. And the third common characteristic is unity of self and moral goals. So again, we go back to that these people don't distinguish between their personal identity and their ethical convictions. It's the same thing. So morality is central to who they are. So they stay on the right track of being sure to always listen to yourself. So the old Shakespeare saying, to thy own self be true, this is exactly what encompasses the characteristics of a good role model and people who make moral decisions because they are true to themselves, because they can be certain and positive that they are on that track to do so. Another way that we can build character is through hearing stories. So hearing stories does all of these following things. So the first one is it acts as a flight simulator. So a flight simulator means that the story lets us practice out our emotional responses without us having to get off the ground, so to speak. So as an example, in The Dark Knight, if you remember, the Joker put people on two different boats. On one boat was a bunch of prisoners, and on one ferry boat was a bunch of everyday citizens. And on both boats, he had explosives. He then told each boat that if they hit their button, then the other boat would blow up and they would be saved. But they had to decide as a boat whether or not they were willing to blow up another group of people in order to save themselves. So there was that great moral dilemma because the everyday citizens were thinking to themselves, well, these are prisoners. Do they like, sure, we can kill them and then we would save ourselves. They were already in prison, so they must be bad people. And then the prisoners had their own dilemma of what they should do. And so you kind of got to see that play out in the movie. Well, us as individuals, we got to sit there at home or in the movie theater, wherever you watch the movie, and think about, well, what would we do in that situation? So we got to make up our own mind without having to ever make a decision that would ever put anyone in harm's way. So it got to let us simulate those emotions and that thought process without ever having to do that in real life. The second thing that hearing stories does is it gives us good additional role models. So obviously, when we talked about role models a second ago, we were talking about finding role models in your real life. Like, who are your role models, whether it's your parents or a former boss, something like that. But this gives us role models that are outside of people that we actually know because it provides us with people who have vices and virtues that we may never get to meet. So it's a totally different realm of people that we get to select from for role models. Another thing that hearing stories does is it sends a positive message. So I'd say 95% of the time, good always wins when we think about movies. So in Star Wars, it's always, the light over the dark. And in Hunger Games, the good ends up winning over the evil people in charge. And then in most of the Avengers movies, without giving too much away, if you haven't watched the Avengers, the Avengers win at the end and it's a positive outcome. So this gives us the positive message that if we keep doing the right thing, good will always win and we will triumph. The next thing that it does, but through hearing stories, is it can change or reinforce our beliefs. So as we're being absorbed in the story, especially if you're reading instead of watching a movie, you really start to think like the characters and you really get absorbed in all of their decision makings. So as you start to see things through the different characters' sight and their perspective, it could shift your attitudes. So it's either going to help you reinforce what you already think, or it might change the way you believe about something, depending on how those characters think and how they react and how the story plays out. Then we get to understand our possibilities and limits. So this does force us to confront death and the factors that we can't control. So if we think about movies like Gladiator or I Am Legend or Braveheart, these are all movies where the good guy dies in the end. So there's usually like a positive message with them dying, but it still forces us to understand that there are limits and that we will have to face death one day, and not always death in the physical sense, but also death in like the sense of failure, or I mean, you might be fired one day. There are all things that there are limits to what you can do as a leader, and understanding that you can do everything in your power, and then sometimes you still can't make the difference you want because there are limits. And then finally, it lets us escape our old ways of thinking. So we get to expand our emotional capacity, and it gives us a look into a new world. So there are so many great books and movies and TV shows out there that really stretch us emotionally. So it's really important to let yourself feel those emotions and really think through the processes of how those characters are thinking and acting, and whether or not you would do the same thing based on any given situation. All of those will help you build your leadership character, all through doing stuff that you do every day if you look at it now, maybe through this lens. So, facing hardship also builds leadership character, and we need to understand that we need to embrace our crucible moments. So, our crucible moments are our defining moments in our lives. So, most leaders that we admire have endured hardship, and they've endured one or maybe many crucible moments. So, crucible moments let you see who you are and build on your own experience. So, by definition, a crucible is a situation of severe trial in which different elements interact, leading to the creation of something new. So a new territory crucible is where you're taking on an assignment overseas, you're serving in a new role. So although new territory crucibles can be fun, they're definitely a learning experience. So an example from my life is that after my freshman year in college, I decided to move to a new state to go to a new college. And transferring schools may not seem like that big of a deal, but I had gone to college with about 5 people that I went to high school with. So when I first went to college, I had a built-in safety net of friends and people to hang out with, and kind of to ease me into the college life of meeting new people. But moving to a whole nother state where I didn't know anybody at my school was a very new territory crucible for me, because I had to get a brand new job. I had to make friends all over again. And I hadn't had to make friends since I was in elementary school, because I had had the same friends for so many years. So this was a really good crucible moment for me, because it allowed me to figure out who I was without everybody I had been surrounded from for my entire life. So really embrace those new territory crucible moments and seek them out. So if you have a chance to study abroad, if you have a chance to take a promotion, if you have a chance to go do something that you would probably never do, go do that, because it's going to be such a great learning experience for you. Next, we have reversal crucibles. And so these generally come from like loss, defeat, failure, loss of a loved one or job, failure on a project. So we know, as pictured, Abraham Lincoln, he had many crucible moments. So he lost 2 of his sons, and had to deal with a wife who had mental illness, and then obviously loss after loss in the Civil War until it finally got to the end. So there was lots of loss and defeat in Abraham Lincoln's life, and yet he was able to overcome that. He was able to learn from that. So never think of a loss or a failure as just a loss or failure. There's always something that you can learn from it. And if you get through that, it makes you stronger. And so I know all of you have probably, unfortunately, had a reversal crucible. But just know that you got through that. So that makes you a stronger person. And then lastly, we have suspension crucibles, and these are extended periods of time for reflection or contemplation. And so this could be time in between promotions or time in between jobs. So if you've been in your current position for 4 or 5 years at least, or maybe even longer, and you haven't been promoted and you haven't really been giving anything more challenging, this is actually a suspension crucible that you were in that you didn't even know it. This is your time to kind of reflect and decide, what do you want to do next? So are you comfortable? Are you happy in your work? Maybe you are. So maybe there's other challenges in your personal life that you can take. Or do you want a promotion? Do you want a different job? Is there something else that you are still seeking um, in order to become who you are? So those are our crucible moments. So let's move on now. So we need to talk about developing habits. So one way to build character is through developing good habits. So habits are repeated routines or practices designed to foster virtuous behavior. So again, when I talked earlier about virtues, I said that we needed to practice them in order to make them stronger. So according to research, and I know this varies depending on what site you look at, but it takes about 66 days to form a habit. Um, but it takes 21 days to break a bad habit. So if you're trying to stop eating junk food or stop smoking or something like that, it's going to take at least 21 days to break that habit. But the easiest way to break that habit is actually just to replace it with a new habit, which hopefully is a good habit. So if you're trying to stop smoking, the best way to do that is to find something good to replace that. So if every time you have a craving to smoke, you go for a run, then you're replacing it with good habit and you've created a good habit while breaking the bad one. The bad news is that if you do create a good habit, it usually only takes like a day or two to break a good habit, so you really have to stick with it. There's actually a book that's called The Power of Habit that it's not required for this class, but it's also on Audible, so you can listen to it if you don't want to read it. But it's really interesting as it talks about how we form habits and how habits are a totally different part of your memory and mind. And so if you haven't read that, it's a great book to go out to read and talks about creating new and good habits. So let's talk about how we can develop these new habits. So one is to be proactive. So take initiative and don't be reactive. So don't wait until a situation has got bad. So if you're trying to become a healthier person, don't wait until you have reached your max weight before you start exercising. Like start doing something about it now. Like don't wait till you have a heart attack before you start eating better. Take initiative and don't be reactive to the situation. Second, begin with the end in mind. So get a mental picture of what you want to happen and then make it a habit. So you need to set your goals at the beginning of the day, whether or beginning of the week or month or year. So one of the things that I do is I actually keep a regular written planner, and at the beginning of the year I set my goals for the whole year. And then based on those goals, so like if I say I want to read 12 books this year, then my goal every month is to read a book. So then I break my goals down so that I can do them slowly. Then every month during the week, I'll say, okay, you need to read so many chapters, depending on how big the book is that month, so many chapters this week. And then that helps me reach my goals by taking the bigger picture and breaking it down to the month, to the week, to the day, so that way I can make sure I achieve these goals. But I begin with the end in mind. So I begin the year knowing I'm going to read 12 books. Just like I begin the day knowing that this is my to-do list that I have to do today. And then once I finish this, that my week will be that much easier once I'm done. Next thing, put first things first. So you need to prioritize and make time for important stuff. So we all have a to-do list, whether you write it down or whether it's just mental, stuff that you need to do every single day. But when time is running short, you really need to prioritize what is important. So what's the most important thing for me to do today? So is it finishing this essay because I have a deadline and I have to submit it tomorrow? Or, is it reading the book that, okay, it's on my to-do list to read for the month, but I still have another week so I can put it off. So make sure you prioritize and make time for important stuff. And then think win-win. So cooperation and trusting relationships. So you need to go into situations with the thought that everyone can have a good outcome. If you go into any situation, whether it's home or whether it's work, whether it's with your friend, and think, well, I have to give up something in order for this to work, or they're going to have to give up for something in order for this to work, then you're not thinking win-win, and you're not thinking in terms of cooperation. So go into every situation thinking this can be a good outcome, and you'll develop the habit of trying to find a cooperative way to work versus a competitive way to work. And then seek first to understand and then to be understood. So this is really about empathetic listening. So we need to learn the concerns of others, and this will help keep us from misunderstanding the situation. So again, if we're going to go into a situation thinking win-win, then we really have to understand, what does the other person want from this? So really think about, how can you put others first? How can you understand what they want? And listen. I mean, because sometimes that's all people need. And really listen, eh, listen to understand, not just listen so that way you can speak next. Next is synergize. And so this is create a solution that is greater than some of the parts. So what this means is that there are alternative solutions that are creative that you can use. A lot of times we think of solutions as a standard within a box, and we fall into that trap of thinking that the only solutions that are available to us are the very first ones that we can think of, or the ones that have been tried beforehand. This isn't true. So be creative, and you can come up with um, better solutions um, that will help the overall situation. And then finally, the last one, sharpen the saw. So this is probably, I would say, is one of the most important parts of developing a habit. So this is renewal of your physical, of your mental, of your social and emotional self. So this means good nutrition, this means stress management, and this means you have to take care of yourself. So when we go back to the one where I say put first things first and the most important thing, sometimes the most important thing for you to prioritize on your list is you. So sometimes if you have 20 minutes left in the day and you have to choose between finishing your essay or going for a run, so you don't feel stressed and having an anxiety attack, go for a run. And then your teachers, if they have 24-hour grace periods like I do, then you can turn it in the next day. It's not that big of a deal. So sometimes you have to put yourself first on your list. So always remember that no matter how big your to-do list gets or how many habits you're trying to develop, the habit of taking care of yourself is the most important habit that you can have. So next we're going to talk about mission statements. So mission statements are one of the best ways to keep the end or your destination in mind. So when we talk about beginning with the end in mind, this is what helps you do that, because this gives you that end. So mission statements are generally more effective than resolutions because they identify the underlying sources of our behavior. So the difference would be in, like, as in a resolution is I want to lose weight. But the mission statement is that I want to lead a healthy lifestyle that will allow me to have more energy in order to participate in my own life. So that really gives us the understanding of, I just don't want to lose weight. I know that my end goal is I want to participate more actively in my own life. I want to be able to run around with my kids, or I want to be able to go hiking when my friends ask me to. I want to not be limited because of my weight. And so it really is that the bigger picture statement. So same thing with a resolution. If you say, um, I want to graduate with my degree, that is a great goal and a great resolution. But if your mission statement, I want to become more educated so that way I can set an example for my children, then that is beginning with the end in mind and really keeps your destination as the focus of, I want to be that role model for my children. And so that's why I want to do this. So when we look at this, this was an example of Oprah Winfrey's mission statement, and her mission statement was to be a teacher and to be known for inspiring my students to be more than they thought they could be. So obviously, Oprah Winfrey is not a teacher, but in a sense, she's still inspiring her viewers to be more than what they thought they could be. And so, even though the goal of the teacher is not quite what she ended up being as far as a teacher in a classroom, she is a teacher on her show and on stage and inspiring others. So that's an example of how you can develop a personal mission statement with the destination in mind. So as you guys move forward for this class, I do encourage you to think about, what would your personal mission statement be? So, as your mission statement identifies your final destination, your values are the moral compass in order to get there. So, you really need to think about your priorities. So, values provide a frame of reference for helping us to distinguish between right and wrong and then what we prioritize. So pages 94 and 95 in your book gives us a couple of lists to help us reflect on our priorities, whether it's achievement, belonging, concern for the environment, creativity, financial prosperity, health, humility. These are all things to help us focus on. What we don't want to have as a priority are materialistic things. So wealth, possessions, status, fame, personal image, all of these things tend to lead to a lower quality of life. People who have materialistic values also tend to experience depression, and they're at higher risk for drug and alcohol use. So you really want to think about what are your priorities. So I encourage you to go to those pages in the book, look those lists over, and pick out three. What are your top three values that you prioritize in your life? You probably already have them and didn't even realize that they like never had actually put words to them, but go through and think about those. But values must be translated into actions. So as you think about those, and you've probably already had those kind of set in your mind and not even realized it, you've been working towards those values and those priorities your whole life. So um, leaders who've had values but have ignored them are the ones who tend to engage in fraud and deception. So it really is important that as you identify those values, that you keep those in mind with all your decision making. So think about it. What are your priorities? Go into the book, look them over, and then pick out a couple that you know for sure are your priorities and that you want to work towards. So here's a list of some of the priorities for you to think about that were on those pages um, as you go through and set your goals and priorities. So for our debate this week, we're going to talk about is can you be a libertine and a good leader? So a libertine is a person, especially a man, who behaves without moral principles or a sense of responsibility, especially in sexual matters. So this is really focusing kind of on the idea of moderation in a leader and whether or not you think someone can be a good leader if they do something that may be immoral in their personal life. So when we think about being a libertine and a good leader is does it make a difference or not if the person who is acting irresponsibly in sexual matters or maybe having a lot of sexual partners, does it make a difference if they're single or married? Like, do we care more or less? Do we care more or less if their work starts to suffer because of what they're doing outside of their job? Um, where do we draw the line between the public and the personal matters when it comes to our leaders? So, would you vote for somebody who was known as a playboy? What about somebody who was a gambler or a drinker? Thomas Jefferson was listed as the seventh best, I believe, president, and he was known to have fathered at least 6 children with Sally Hemings. Um, one of his slaves where they actually met in Paris and she was free, and then he actually negotiated for her to be brought back to the United States under extraordinary privileges. Kennedy was actually voted the 8th best president, and he had 11 affairs. His obviously most notorious was with Marilyn Monroe, but he also had an affair with a CIA agent's ex-wife and numerous White House secretaries and interns and actresses and call girls and mob girls and even a spy. But we still regard him as a good leader despite um, his personal ongoings. Bill Clinton was known as the 15th best president, but he, as we know, had numerous affairs, one with Monica Lewinsky, one with Jennifer Flowers, among others. And then we have Nelson Mandela, who was highly regarded as a leader, but he was married 3 times. His second wife was 16 years younger than him. So, although that's not necessarily an affair, that is personal stuff outside of what we would have as the standard of maybe good behavior. And then the last one we have is Prince Harry, or former Prince Harry. And obviously, he was known as a big playboy before he got with Meghan Markle. And we know that he's currently stepped down of his role as family royalty. But if it happened to be that he was going to be the next King of England, how would we feel about having someone who had that kind of playboy past as the next King of England if you were an English citizen? So these are all things to think about as you read the modern day libertine case study and as you go into the debate. Make sure you guys are getting your sources and citing them. And I look forward to reading those. Have a wonderful week.